Hey folks, welcome to part 2 of Module 1. Today I am joined by Foxy in the background here, who is going to be demonstrating her superior napping skills. In this video, I'm hoping to demystify the MLC process a little bit. So I'm going to introduce the MLC or multi-literacy circles that we're doing this week and provide a bit of background. And then I'm going to talk about what exactly this process looks like in our class before sharing some tips based on my previous experience and things that my previous learners have shared with me. And for those of you who have done MLC process before with me, there is going to be some repetition in this video, so you may want to skip over parts of it. I do recommend watching the part where I talk about the process for this class, since this is a little bit different than previous classes that I've done. So for example, I've changed around some of the roles, so please do watch that part. But otherwise, it should be a process that you're fairly familiar with. So let's start things off with what are MLC groups. So multi-literacy circles are a variation on literacy circles. So online literature circles consist of small student-led groups of learners who meet virtually to discuss the course readings. And there are different roles that are meant to help guide this discussion, and group members rotate through these different roles. And these are meant to be really collaborative and are focused on bringing your own experiences and knowledge into your discussions of the readings. Now, what makes this format that we're using in this class a multi-literacy circle versus a traditional literacy circle? Well, with MLCs, we go beyond traditional print media like textbooks and articles. With our increasingly technological world, literacy is now multimodal, and we need to be able to interact with electronic media. Thus, there's a need to develop these multi-literacy skills. So in the MLC format, you'll be bringing in sources beyond textbooks and articles, like videos and websites. And the benefit of using these MLC circles is that it adds a social element into our class. And one article I found reports that some graduate students have formed friendships with other students through MLC groups like this. And this is consistent with my own experiences using MLCs in the online classes that I teach. So how are we actually going to be doing this MLC process in our class? So as I said, these MLC groups are the small literacy circles that you'll be working with this semester. So these will be about 4 to 5 members, and throughout the MLC modules, you'll be rotating through 4 different roles, including the director, facilitator, summarizer, and commentator. And so as I mentioned earlier, for those of you who have done MLCs with me previously, I have switched up these roles a little bit this semester, so you'll notice that the discussant is now called the facilitator. So these do look a little bit different. I have also removed the reader response paper, which I'll discuss in a moment. So the director. So the director is in charge of providing overall leadership during their MLC module. And a lot of learners had suggested that it would be really helpful having a role that was dedicated to just logistics and organization. So meet the new and improved director role. So the director will be taking responsibility for things like meeting logistics, making sure is everyone on top of everything like deadlines, connecting with me if needed, and providing support to the facilitator during the group discussion if there's anything they need help with. They're also responsible with sharing an additional resource with their group that aligns with the topic covered in that module to provoke discussion. So this is really where that multi-literacy piece comes in. For example, this could be a video, book review, news article, blog post, website, infographic, etc. And you can do journal articles here too if you like. And I used to have the summarizer do this, but I found that that was a lot of responsibility for one person in a 2-week period, so I have reassigned this additional resource piece to the director. So in summary, the director is in charge of overall leadership and identifying that additional resource for the week. And the facilitator is the person who is leading the discussion portion of that module. So they are responsible for creating discussion questions for their group based on the readings and the additional resource that the director will be sharing. They may also plan some sort of activity for their group if they would like to do that in lieu of a discussion question. So in the past, I've had students do word clouds and mind maps. And they are responsible for facilitating the meeting, whether this is asynchronous or synchronously. So posing questions and making sure everyone gets the opportunity to contribute to the discussion. And as a tip for our discussants, having a meeting agenda, or at the very least sharing your questions ahead of time, makes it much easier for you to facilitate these discussions. And the summarizer's role is quite straightforward. They're just responsible for taking notes during the group's discussion, and then they're going to write that up into a little summary, which they will then be posting onto Brightspace so other groups can read it. And they will share this at the end of their module as the summarizer. And the commentator's main responsibilities really come in at the end of the module. So they will review all of those posts that were made by the summarizers and write a summary to share with their group. So some summarizers do this by going group by group, and some like to focus on overarching themes they saw or potentially points of contention between different groups. So the general flow of this whole process is that at the beginning of the module, you're completing the readings, and the director is looking for an additional resource. This then gets sent out to the rest of the group. The entire group reviews the resources that were shared, and our facilitator writes some discussion questions, or plans some activities. The group then meets, and more on this in a moment, to discuss the discussion questions or participate in the activity that's been planned. And during the meeting, the summarizer is taking notes, which they post to Brightspace for the rest of the class. The commentator then goes into the Brightspace discussion board, reads them, and circulates a summary of these posts to their group. So what are the deadlines for this? So in your MLC guide, I have included some proposed timelines for you to follow, and this is based on what's worked well for previous students. I've also outlined the due dates in tables for each of the roles. However, you may want to shift some of these around depending on your schedules. And while I have recommended one meeting during the module, synchronous groups, for example, often prefer to meet weekly. And sometimes asynchronous groups just like to chat across the full 2 weeks. So as long as your group is happy with the schedule that you've come up with and it isn't impeding anybody's learning, I'm fine with you playing around with these dates. However, I do ask that the summarizers try to get their summary posted to Brightspace by the second Thursday of the module. I will say from previous experiences doing this, it's very, very stressful for the commentators when the summarizers leave everything to Sunday night. So commentators, if you find that yourself in that situation, just summarize what is posted, get it to your group, and just move on to the next module. So how are you actually going to be meeting, since this is an online class and we can't actually meet in person? Even if it wasn't online, we can't really meet in person right now anyways. So your group will be meeting virtually. You may choose to do this synchronously, so all being online at the same time, or you may choose to do this asynchronously when you're coming into the conversation at different times throughout the module. So some examples of how previous students have done this. WhatsApp is very, very popular with this assignment, as is Google Docs. Zoom is another great one. Some people have also done Google Slides with the notes section where they had their little discussion down there, with each slide being dedicated to a different question. I will also make Brightspace discussion boards available to the group each week, so when you go into the activity section, I will have posted an optional discussion board for you. You don't have to use this. It's just a place that you can use if you prefer to chat on Brightspace. So before I go into some tips for making the whole MLC process easier, I wanted to quickly touch on your portfolios. So the portfolio is meant to be a collection of your work that showcases a record of your development and growth over the MLC modules. Here you'll be documenting your artifact from that week. So if you're the facilitator, this will be your discussion questions. And it will also contain several prompts to reflect on the group process and your own learning, as well as applying concepts to your future practice and your developing philosophy of teaching. And the MLC portfolio has 6 prompts for you to respond to. So the first one being your role. So include whatever your role was for that module. For example, the director. Artifacts. So include the artifacts from your role. If you are the facilitator, for example, this would be your discussion questions. What went well? So talk about what went well during your MLC meeting. And you can also talk about what went well in terms of your own professional development. Even better if, or EBI. So how could your MLC meeting have been even better? And how might your group address this EBI to make the next module better? And once again, you can also talk about your own professional development in this section if you like. New learning. So what are some new things you learned this week about learning theories and applying them that you didn't know previously or hadn't previously considered? Connections to your philosophy. So how might the ideas presented in this module impact or even not impact your philosophy of teaching and learning? And connections to practice. So how might you apply this module to your current or future practice as an educator? And for this class, these connections to practice and your philosophy are really, really important for this portfolio. So now on to some tips. So I've used MLC groups in, I think, 4 courses now, so this will be my 5th time using this process. And so based on my own experiences and talking to my previous students, I've put together some tips for you. So the first one is the first week is really confusing. And this isn't so much a tip as it is a reassurance. So the MLC group work is more complex than a lot of the traditional online discussions you'll see in online courses. So kind of the traditional, you go on the discussion board, you make one post, and then you respond to 2, and then that's it. I find, at least in my experience with this type of approach, that learning is really shallow, and a lot of students will just kind of do this the night before it's due, and there's just less class engagement. So the MLC process is more complex and has a lot of roles, but in my experience, once you've done one of these cycles and you get more into the rhythm of it, it becomes much easier. And students often comment on this in their portfolio, so they'll say that the first module was really confusing, it was tough, they weren't really sure what they were doing, and then usually by the second time round, they're feeling a lot more confident and they're impressed with how much better it flowed their second time round. So if you're struggling this first week, just know that this is completely normal and it absolutely will get easier. My second but probably biggest tip would be update your portfolios regularly. So the portfolio portion of this assignment should be relatively easy, so long as you're staying on top of it. And then also engaging in these reflection questions will contribute to your own learning and personal growth throughout the semester. So if you leave this all until the very end of the semester, it is going to be far more difficult and you aren't going to get as rich of a learning experience from this process. So make a habit of going in even maybe once a week and just adding even some bullet points, which you can always go back to and elaborate on later, but just don't leave it until the end. My next tip is use your EBIs to improve your group work. So try to come up with some actionable ideas too in your portfolio. So say if you found in your first meeting that everyone was kind of all over the place and you're going off on tangents, perhaps suggest that in future weeks you might want to have an agenda to help guide that discussion. Not only will this help improve the group process, but students who include these sorts of things in their portfolio tend to get higher marks. And speaking of agendas, as I mentioned earlier, if you're doing synchronous meetings especially, having an agenda or some sort of guide for your discussion can make things go a lot more smoothly. And I would encourage you to, if you're doing an agenda, work in some time to chat with your group members, check in with each other, see how your other courses are going, things like that. My next tip is one that's a little bit more difficult for some people, but I do recommend trying to meet synchronously if possible. So I found with previous groups that it's easier to have much richer discussions when meeting synchronously. Previous students who've met synchronously say that they really look forward to having these meetings. And some of them were actually meeting weekly, even though I only asked them to do it once a module. And I've also had some students comment that meeting synchronously gave them some sense of normalcy and social interaction during the pandemic when, at least in Ontario right now, we're all stuck at home. And most synchronous groups also spend some time catching up and talking about their lives, other courses, assignments they're doing, things like that. So it becomes a nice little online community for you. Now, I know this isn't possible for everyone, especially those of you who work in healthcare or other jobs like this that have a lot of shift work. Different time zones can also make it difficult, although I find in my experience, usually the groups that have the biggest time zone differences are usually the ones that are most committed to trying to meet synchronously. So I've even had people like staying up until 10 o'clock at night so they can talk to people in different time zones. For example, I've had groups that had people across North America, China, and Australia, and they still managed to meet synchronously, which was pretty impressive. This can also be difficult for some learners with exceptionalities, for example, a hearing impairment. However, in such situations, you can still meet synchronously. You would just then want to do a text-based option. So for example, you could meet synchronously and talk to each other through text on WhatsApp. And then my final tip is make your portfolio your own. So the portfolio is meant to capture your learning and your reflections, so really make it unique to you. And while, yes, I do post some very specific questions, this is still meant to be very unique to your own learning process. So in the past, I've had students include things like mind maps that they put together on the readings because it was something that really connected with their teaching philosophy, and they kind of wanted to brainstorm how this was going to fit in with their philosophy. I've also had students include pictures and other artifacts from their learning and teaching. So for example, pictures of activities they have done in their own classrooms, lesson plans, things like that. I've also had some parents who reflected on the learning experiences of their own children and then kind of put a theoretical lens on it to analyze that situation. This is also a great way to make your portfolio more novel. And for those of you who are a little bit more extrinsically motivated, that's a good way to get a higher grade. And that's all for now, folks. I hope this video helped demystify the MLC process a little bit. As I said earlier, do make sure you are referring to the syllabus and our MLC guide for further details on this process, since this is just an overview here. So things are explained in a little bit more detail in those documents, particularly the MLC guide. And if any questions arise while you're reviewing these documents, just shoot me an email or you can ask me a question in the Ask Me a Question document. And happy MLCing, and I will see you all online. Bye.